Okay, good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Future China Global Forum in CNBC, welcome to our little fireside chat here. We're here this morning to hear from a man who is one of the leading and best investors in the world. And he became that by starting, founding, and building Bridgewater into the biggest hedge fund in the world. And I believe it still is, right, Ray? Yeah. So it's not just that, though. Obviously, you've heard him, read his books, his Principles trilogy as well. But this is not just a man who is a thinker. He's also a doer. 55 years of investing, combined with the study of more than 500 years of world history, has made him not just very rich, but also very wise. So, Ray, great to see you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure is all ours. So we have about 45 minutes, not that much time with somebody like Ray. And towards the end, the last 5-10 minutes or so, we'll be taking questions, or rather, I'll be asking some of the questions that are coming in from you all in the audience. So I look forward to that. I think Ray does as well, engaging with you all. But Ray, let's start with this, the famous five, as it were. The five forces that you've written and talked about extensively. Just to remind folks here in the audience what that is all about. These are the forces that are going to shape the world, our lives, and also investor returns for the foreseeable future. So what are we talking about here with the five forces?
Well, first of all, thank you, everyone. Thank you for those of the Future China Global Forum for having me. Thank you. And thank you for asking that question. Just to put it in perspective, my perspective, I'm a global macro investor, which for 55 years has brought me into countries and into situations like China. I started going to China in 1984, helped them develop the stock markets, and have been going for a long time. And so I'm now at a phase in my life where I'm passing some of these things along, so writing books and so on. And one of the things that I learned in my life is that many of the surprises that I encountered there were surprises to me because they never happened in my lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So I knew that I needed to understand history by going back. And there were three big things that were apparent and that are dominant for all the countries in all the world that made me study the last 500 years of history to understand them. And those are first, the debt, money, economic cycle, the growth in the amount of debt. That's true in China. That's true in the United States. It's very important in the markets and economies. So that dynamic, what causes a rise and decline of a reserve currency, those things, that brought me back 500 years. The second is the internal order and disorder cycle. When there's great political extremism, populism, irreconcilable differences. I never experienced this in my lifetime. And we have now this repeating. The third is, of course, the great power conflict, the rise and declines of great powers, and that dynamic and how that works. So those three factors are dominant factors, and they made me want to study them. And and they transpire in big cycles. For example, the New World Order began in 1945 at the end of World War II. In that research, I also discovered that acts of nature, droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars and toppled more orders than the other factors. And then, of course, number 5 throughout history has been man's inventiveness and the development of new technologies. So what I saw was those 5 big forces, the debt money, the internal order and disorder conflict, the great power conflict, the acts of nature, and the technology changes interrelate to each other to produce a dynamic and a cycle. So in order to convey that picture now, my stage in life, I wrote a book, which was The Changing World Order, and I put a video, an animated video together to try to convey it. The animated video is about 40 minutes, but if I could take about 4 minutes of your time and the audience time, I brought it. Would I be able to show it?
Sure, absolutely. Let's roll it. Have a look.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict,
its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
So that's it in a nutshell. So I think if we're looking at the countries, the United States, China, other countries, we're seeing a lot of that.
So, Ray, listen, we'll get to China in just a bit, which is what this whole forum is all about, right? Especially future China. But I want to get you to talk to us about what's going to be happening in 17, 18 days, the U.S. elections, November the 5th. Very, very tight, very close, I know. Our sense, and you tell me what you think, is that there's a little bit more money betting on a Trump victory. What do you think?
The United States is right now in a great internal conflict, as described there, where there's populism of the left and populism of the right, which reflects great wealth and values differences. That's it. So you have to look at the population to understand why we have the candidates and the parties that we have. And so as we come into this period of time, by populism, we also deal with it's a win at all cost mentality, not a compromise mentality. But compromise is considered a sign of weakness. And so there's a question about whether we're going to have an orderly transition of power. The first question, do we have an orderly transition of power? We're not sure. We're not sure that you're going to have that. That's an amazing thing, right? You have to go back in history to see something like that. Of course, it's repeated many times in history. So if you have a orderly transition of power, you're also going to see this fragmentation and the questioning of whether the system is fair and appropriate. Questioning such as the questioning the Supreme Court, questioning these different values. Where do you live? The differences in the values go down to matters like how do you raise your children related to issues of sexuality. Do you allow a 10-year-old to decide what sex they are?
Very personal, yeah.
These are not compromisable questions. And so you see that kind of environment. You see a deterioration in infrastructure and so on. That is causing people to go to different states.
Right. Let me jump in here. How concerned are you that these elections are going to be contested? By that, I mean, regardless of who wins, that the results might not be accepted. I mean, if you had to put a probability on it, what would it be? Or is it too hard to handle?
I don't really know. I would say if it's a close Trump loss, I would say it's almost an even probability. If it depends if it's Trump win, it's a different story. So I would say if you put the two together, maybe a 1 in 3.
Oof.
I don't know if I'm right about that.
Well, we'll see.
But the fact that we are having this conversation and that we consider this as not being crazy, that is a reflection of where we are, where we've come to.
Let me ask you, you've been reading some of your stuff, in fact, a lot of your stuff ahead of our talk this morning, and you've written before that this is with regards to China, but it potentially could apply to the U.S. I don't know. You tell me. That leaders that emerge are leaders that are demanded or needed by the times that they're in. You might be able to apply that to Xi Jinping. I think you suggested that before. Would that also apply to the U.S. and Trump? With somebody like Trump, who's more authoritarian, be the kind of leader that the times call for during the U.S.
Yeah, during such times of great conflict, it is normally the case that you have the powerful autocratic leader at a fight, and then you enter into periods of reform. Like, so if we go into China, there's unity when you're fighting the war against Japan, and then there's a civil war, and then there's a winner of the war, and then there's dealing with the opposition of that dynamic. Donald Trump is a manifestation of the condition in the country in terms of that populism.
Okay.
So I think if there was not a Donald Trump, there would be something that's equivalent to that.
Or someone equivalent to that. Interesting. Okay. So, we talk to a lot of people at work, right? And the folks out here, probably the thing they're most interested in or worried about, obviously, November 5th, the outcome of the elections. And if it is Trump, therefore, then tariffs. Everybody seems to be scared of tariffs. What would a Trump presidency, do you think, mean for this part of the world? And we can obviously get to the most important relationship with China as well.
Donald Trump has a classic type of economic policy that we've seen, particularly in the 1930s, such as in Germany, which is a protectionist, nationalist, isolationist policy in which you establish great tariffs. Tariffs are an effective way of raising tax money, by the way. Roughly speaking, if you did his promises, and I did the calculations, if China was increased to 60% and there was a 20% across the board elsewhere tariffs, that would raise about $800 billion a year, which is it's quite a bit of money. And then with that protectionist, then there's the investing in the country and the building up of things in a, that kind of a way. So it would be, you can imagine what it means company by company. If you're in an internal company and you're getting protectionism, you're going to benefit in terms of now all of a sudden you're getting the competition. Of course, it means inefficiency on a global basis, so that it means that the amount of money that's going to, the costliness of goods is going to be a problem. But there's a view that tariff money will also be a form of taxation. Where are you going to get the money to deal with our very big deficit? The deficit situation is a big number. So are you going to get it from taxes? Where are you going to get the money? And that's part of a class warfare thing. So that idea of getting the tax money and get from that source, even though it's inflationary, you could say that taxes is a type of inflation, in a sense, for those who pay it. So there's very much a capitalist, socialist, left-right thing going on. And so, of course, if you're on the other side and you're dependent about exporting to the United States, then that's going to be a problem.
Regardless of who wins, most folks think that the deficit are still not going to get addressed. I'm sure you agree with that, right? When is the shoe going to drop? I'm talking about the U.S. debt and deficit.
I'm sorry? Say that again?
When is the shoe going to drop? Neither candidate seems
this happens.
Either
there's a sequence of how this transpires all the time throughout history. What happens is creation of credit gives buying power. It also creates debt. One man's debts are another man's assets. What do you do when you have too much debt? You, at the end of the day, when you have too much debt, there's either a default or there's a debt monetization, that the central bank takes money and prints the money and makes it easier to pay back the debt. In all cases through history, including the Great Depression, they print the money, which then has its consequences. It just took longer in the Great Depression. 1929, it took them until 1933. March of 1933, they break the link with gold and they print the money. So that is going to create the dynamic. That means holding bonds, and what is a bond? It is a promise to receive all that money.
It's an IOU, yeah.
And it can produce much more inflation. So that's the dynamic. That's what's going to happen. It'll ultimately be, up to a large extent, monetized. Now, there's a good way of doing that, and there's a bad way of doing that. A good way of doing a deleveraging, in other words, one way or another, you have to bring the debt down relative to the incomes. And there's a good way of doing that and a bad way of doing that. If you're a country in which the debt is mostly denominated in your currency, and mostly the debtors and the creditors are in your country, you can do a beautiful deleveraging. You can manage this a lot better. By the way, that's true for China, and it's true for the United States. And so how do you bring the debt down? First, you have to do a debt restructuring of some form. In other words, there's too much debt, can't pay it all back. Some of it has to be marked down, and it's got to be cleaned off the balance sheets. When you clean it off the balance sheets and you mark it down because one man's debts are another man's assets, that means that somebody's going to get hurt by that process, but it's deflationary, that act in and of itself. But it's necessary to get it off the balance sheet and cleaned up, and you move forward. The other way you can get the debt down is you produce more money and you make it easier to pay the debt, but that's inflationary. So what I call a beautiful deleveraging is when that's done in a balanced way, because one way or another you have to get the debt burdens down, and that means a certain amount of deflationary getting them down by doing a debt restructuring, and a certain amount of inflationary so that they balance, and then you get the debts down, is the best way of doing that.
So let me ask you, you've studied 500 years of history, right? Is there precedent for this? Has it ever been done successfully?
Oh, yeah.
What you're advocating, this beautiful deleveraging, which is basically deleveraging as well as lowering rates at the same time.
Yes. The 2008 financial crisis was a good example of that. When they chose to become fiscally and monetarily stimulant. I've been in the United States. I've seen 4 major deleveragings, debt crises, very similar to China's. And in China, Zhu Rongji did a successful debt restructuring and process in the 90s. So this can be done. And it is done. One way or another, you get them behind. It takes how long to do it. There's that simple formula. In Japan, what they failed to do is do a restructuring of the debt so that the debts remained on the balance sheets and the entities were impaired. And then they never made interest rates lower than the nominal growth rate of the economy, or they never made interest rates lower than the inflation rates. So they had high real interest rates relative to this, and they had a debt burden that took them 25 years. So there are bad cases, but it's like a surgery. This can be done. So that's the real interesting question of China in terms of how it's approaching its debt issue, and and the United States and how it's going to approach it.
So Ray, I know that you worry that although this is one of your prescriptions, right, for how China ought to be dealing with its debt situation, you worry that if it does not do all or at least part of this, right, it could end up being like Japan. They could end up losing half a generation, a lost decade plus, more.
Yes, I think that there needs to be this. You have to get the restructuring done, and it's difficult. And then you have to have the right monetary policies to do that. I think that China has, because it's denominated in its currency, and they have the capabilities of doing it because it was done, as I say, under Zhu Rongji. It's a very politically challenging things because you determine whose wealth it is. It's a very challenging thing. They have the capacity to do that. And I believe they have the willingness to do that. That's being demonstrated by policies. So I think they have the capacity to do that. But we're at that point. I think the changes that are taking place are terrific changes, but you still have to do the debt restructuring to get it. It's particularly challenging because of a few other things that are going on in China. First, the local government debt is a problem. That's not a central government debt. And the local governments were getting money by selling real estate and borrowing a lot of money from other companies in their areas. So how do you get them money and not have it wasted? And I think it's something like 83% of government spending is local government spending. So it has a big effect on there. So in one way or another, that's a difficult structure to deal with. The second issue that they have to deal with is the tax issue. The tax system hasn't developed as effectively, and so there's not as an effective an income tax. There's not a real estate tax and different types of taxes. So you need that. There's tax reform, which is being now undertaken. And then, of course, there's an issue with the low retirement age and the aging population. The average age of retirement, the real age of retirement, is 53 in China. A 53-year-old lives till 84. So that means there's 31 years of care that needs to be taken, and it's a financial issue.
Someone's got to pay for it. Yeah,
worked out so well. So these are issues for reform. China has the capacity to do it. Like, as I say, I went and started in 1984. Since I went in 1984, per capita income has increased by 29 times. The life expectancy's increased by 10 years. The poverty rate, from hunger poverty rate's gone from 88% to less than 1%. Tremendous results. So there's the capability of dealing with great challenges, and there's a great force there. The real issue is getting to these things and creating those reforms.
So what I'm hearing you say is they can do it. The ability or capacity is there. Do you get the sense that that is the way that they're moving or leaning now? Because you're on things that aren't anymore.
I think, I think it's been said about the United States or something like they try everything that doesn't work first, and then they eventually get there or something. I mean, that's part of a process of discovering. It's part of an evolutionary. China is a fantastic evolutionary type of process. These things these reforms I'm talking about they're good signs. So tax reform is a big topic now in China. Also, we've seen the first step toward a raising of the retirement age. That's there. I think that the issues also have to do to what is going on in terms of is it still glorious to be rich?
Is it in China these days?
I think that there's a question in terms of that dynamic, and that greater clarity in policies would be important. So issues like that and associated concerns about that environment. But I think, as President Xi said, there's a 100-year storm on the horizon.
Yep.
And that's those spots in the video where the powers cross and you have some of these challenges. And as I mentioned, those transition periods could be 10 years or more. And during that periods of time, through the Chinese dynasties and the histories, there's been a very much gaining of tight controls. And so I think we're in a period that's quite like that, almost a legalistic period. Legalism is a philosophy, maybe even a step back, maybe halfway back toward more Mao type of policies. I don't think it's clear yet what is the direction and the plan exactly.
Okay.
I think that I am sure of this. There's a lot of uncertainty about these things. So I think everybody in this room would say that there's elements of uncertainty about those things, almost everybody. And I think that if there was greater clarity, that would be good.
Okay. You know, when recently, the last couple of weeks or so, we've been talking about at work how everybody's waiting for stimulus out of China, right? And we're still waiting. They so far haven't kitchen sinked this thing yet, right? They've set things up for it, but we don't have the kinds of numbers that I think investors would want to see and to be able to work with. Is whatever they do though, is it just going to be a stopgap measure to get them through, to go from, look, it's not about condos and bricks and mortar and property. It's about the future, according to Xi Jinping, is going to be about high tech. It's not condos, it's chips. It's going to be chips. In the meantime, though, you got to feed your people.
I'd say it this way. It's so easy to create money and credit and throw it out there. There was a saying, you get it exactly, they want to irrigate without flooding. So everybody says stimulus and throw lots of stimulus at it and so on. Okay, that almost in many ways can reinforce the problem. The issue of moral hazard was, in my conversations with policymakers through this. I've been involved with all of the economic policies all the way through now, and I've had the conversation, is the issue of moral hazard and how do you get that all balanced. So just throwing a lot of money and credit, everybody says that's not, you need to do it correctly. And that's part of a restructuring. That becomes the challenging part of it. I think, that's, that'll be the test.
Okay. You probably remember this, right? Back to deleveraging in China. Back in the day when they last had a banking crisis, right? I remember.
By the way, I just want one more point on that. To build real estate, and that counts as economic growth, or to have economic growth, building real estate that doesn't get occupied and having a real estate bubble is not, and throwing money that way is not a good economic policy, right? President Xi was right when he said, houses are meant to live in, they're not meant to speculate on. So 70% of the economy, over 70% of the economy, the savings was in real estate and so on, and created a big bubble. So I think that what we're seeing is a redirection of resources to certain other areas, and I think that that's good. However, the real question is the vitality still of the private markets. I think that that's the big question. Are you going to get the entrepreneurship and that energy, that can-do energy that gets brought up from that inventiveness of individuals and the capital markets like venture markets and so on?
So that's
the question.
What is your sense on that question? Because the private sector, especially entrepreneurs, I think, especially the techie guys, right? Some of them, at least, are still not sure whether it's safe to come out. From your conversations with people in China.
That's right. One of the great programs that they had was the Little Giants program. Little Giants there was a competition in each of the local governments. They would have competitions in finding out what's the best entrepreneurial businesses, and then investors, venture capital investors and governments would put money in them and they would grow. There's a change in the perception of what it's like to be a little giant. And so it's an issue. in terms of saying, can that happen? I think if I was to pick the one issue, there are these various issues, the debt issue and so on. You have to do that correctly. But this other issue of, that element, is it glorious to be rich, and entrepreneurship, and that private sector inventiveness, I think that we have to wait and see how policies handle.
Okay, Ray, listen, we're getting some questions coming in from the audience, and these are anonymous. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is this is a safe space in this ballroom. Here's one. Do recent changes in technology fundamentally change, one, the nature of empires constructed around new identities rather than national boundaries, and two, the speed or trajectory of empires?
Throughout history, and now more than ever, technology is the source of great power economically and militarily. So yes, it has a huge effect, and now more than ever. I think that we're in a world where there's this nationalism and conflict, isolationism, the things that we talk about. And at the same time, in terms of vibrancy, that these forces of containment within countries and zones are fighting against a flourishing of deal-making and economic activity all around. So there's more deals that are going on. You'll as likely have somebody from any country be all looking at the same deals than ever before. So the force economically of globalization is still a very big, powerful force going on while there's these governments that are trying to contain it. So it's at odds.
Even with tariffs, even with export restrictions?
Oh yeah,
folks are saying globalization
what's happening,
is dead.
and I think what's happening is there are three types. Wars. Let's use wars as an example. There are the two countries at wars, and there's a winner and there's a loser, and then there's a neutral country, those that don't get involved. If you look at histories through wars, the winners lose. They get themselves in debt. Britain is a good example. It gets itself deeply in debt, and it weakens itself. The winners lose. The losers are annihilated. And the real winners are the neutral countries.
Whoa.
So if you really watch that pattern, you're seeing flourishing of capital markets, of talent, and so on, to those neutral countries.
Oh.
In which there's the basics are fundamentally. The basics are very simple. There are three types of basics, or maybe I can extend it to the big five that you're referring to. But first, the financial. Do you, in a country, well, I use these to judge where I'm going to invest. Do they earn more than they spend so they have a good income statement and a good balance sheet? Are they financially safe and good? Second, internal. Do they have good internal order where people work together and they're productive? They educate people well and they're productive. And so now you have an effective society, or are at each other's throats and they're having at odds a great conflict. And third, are they at risk of a war or being involved with the war or not? So, but you can carry that to the other parts of the five, and say climate. Okay, climate is a big issue. So acts of nature, as I say. And so are they going to be significantly affected by climate? And that's going to be costly. And number five is, where are they in technology? Are they technologically innovative and part of that curve? Because the world is now polarizing. Like if you have those five on your side, and particularly, let's say, technology, you're savvy, you have the access to the tools, that's going to make a giant difference in the outcomes. So I look at, let's say, those five the big five, as I call them. I look at those 5 things, I rate those by countries. That can pretty much tell you who the winners and losers will be.
And when you go through that list, right, how does China rate on all those criteria?
Well, China now has a debt crisis it has to go through. In terms of the internal conflict, it's more orderly, but it's, there are elements there. In terms of nature, I think, and how it's dealing with it, I think that of course they have challenges. If you study the dynasties all through it, droughts, floods, and pandemics have been a big influence. However, they've made great progress in dealing with it, but still it's a big issue. And of course, the great power conflict that we're talking about is an issue. And then in technology, they're making fabulous progress. So there are many, many different technologies, but it really is quite remarkable that the progress in almost all of those technologies. There are only the United States and China as effectively in dealing with technologies that are at the best level. So I won't run down the list of it, but there'll be a list of a number of technologies where China is a bit superior, some that the United States is a bit superior, and those are going to have a big effect. For example, let's say in China is encountering protectionism in the United States and Europe, but it's a fabulous manufacturing country. 33% of the world's manufacturing is from China, which is more than the United States, Japan, and Germany combined. And including new technologies, chips. They may not be the most high-level chips, but they're very powerful chips in manufacturing is very effective. And also, 85% of the world's population is in the third world. And so to be able to go to the third world and compete in the third world is a very viable strategy. So I think you're seeing these things, play out. China's very clever and inventive, and there are paths.
All right, including in AI. What I want to ask you, Ray, is do you believe China is ahead of the U.S. in AI, 1? And 2, is that at least part of the solution or answer to their demographic challenges?
There's so many parts of AI of which the United States is ahead in some, and China is ahead in others. I think everybody's really talking about the advanced AI and generative AI and those things, which are going to be quite amazing. China's a bit behind in those. On the other hand, in chips that are very, very effective chips, it can produce them and embed them much less expensively, and they can have great usage throughout the country or in its products very effectively too. So a generalization is not something that you can clearly make. I think so. Anyway, that was part 1 of your question. What was part 2 of the
Part 2 was, is AI at least partly the answer or the solution to addressing China's demographic challenges?
I believe it is, but it has a long way to go. And what you really have to do is have AI and robotics. And so we're seeing quite a bit of work done with AI and robotics. And so I think that's part of it. But there are some things that, the AI and the robotics are not going to be able to do. So the challenge will still be there.
Roy, we've got a rush of last-minute questions because we've got just a couple of minutes left. Here's one. Ray, your historical theory almost always traces the eventual emergence of a unipolar power, a singular power for each era. Is there room for a sustainable multipolar world, is the question for you.
I think the question really is for the world, for each country, is almost, can you rise above it and find the way of harmony? In the world today, we have, by any measure, a higher living standard, more wealth, more conditions that are beneficial as a whole. And our real challenge is how we are with each other. And so I think that there's the ability, but to have a multipolar world. But history has tended to show that sequentially you have a war because who is in control, and then they fight over who is in control. And then after that war, you have a period of peace because, as shown in that video, you have a period of peace because nobody wants to go into war again. They learn what the hell is of a war. And then you also have the fact that you then can deal well with each other. You have a dominant power. It's easier to follow. The global system of like the United Nations, WTO, and so on have always proven less effective or ineffective because of the dominance of power. So I wouldn't be optimistic in terms of us moving toward a multipolar world as being the next part of the sequence.
Not optimistic.
I'm not optimistic of us moving to a multipolar world.
Okay.
And as a natural consequence of this set of circumstances.
Ray, last question, because we're just bumping up against time here. And I'll leave you to navigate this as you see fit, right? Whether it's yourself personally, family office, or even Bridgewater, as far as you could talk to us about, right? How are you positioned with regards to China as a market? How are you sized? Is it the same? Are you increasing your bets? Are you doubling down? Are you pulling back or what?
I always, my mantra for investing is I want 15 good uncorrelated return streams. So you almost can say, what is 1/15th? So let's call that 7 or 8% of a portfolio. And because that way it's never too much to hurt me no matter what happens. And then within there, I want to have a diversified portfolio. So, and so we're committed to China. Well, I say I ran Bridgewater. I've now passed it along. But they are committed, and I'm committed to China as an evolutionary process. The investments in China that we've had because of how we've had balance in the portfolio, which included bonds balancing the equities, has produced returns that are, over the last 6 years since we've done internal, at 16% or so a year through that because there's balance in the portfolio. So I would expect that that will continue to invest in China and keeping it at something like that percentage of the total portfolio, and to do that in a balanced way.
Even through the market meltdown in China markets over the last couple of years?
Yes, because, see, I think that people think that investing in markets is just buying like equities, and then you have the up and down of an equities. They don't know the power of diversification. The power of diversification is to put together a portfolio of things that balance. So because we've had in that portfolio, we've had bonds and we've had some gold in that portfolio to balance, those bonds have done very, very well, while the equities did terribly, and it achieved a balance. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to be in China, all these years I was lucky to help develop the stock market in a little way and be there all along and deal with policy, was to help demonstrate the power of a balanced portfolio, because I believe that the individuals have their choices: a deposit in a bank. The basic investing was a deposit in a bank, real estate, and then when they view stocks, stocks go up and down. So that's not a balanced portfolio. It's not a way to save. Where if you can diversify that portfolio, create a balanced portfolio,
You can create a higher return than cash. You're not dealing with the real estate bubble. So that's why we constructed the portfolio that way, and it's worked, and we're happy to, teach people about it.
16% a year is pretty darn good. On real estate itself, and this is a purely selfish question, so I beg your patience, guys. Just a couple more minutes here. Somebody I was talking to recently was asking the question, I think it's a legitimate one, whether or not the government should be aiming to put a floor under real estate in China, A, or B, actually letting it fall further so prices can clear. What do you think?
They have to have a clearing, proper pricing of those assets, because also there's the debt, there's the holding of them. If they're not priced well, they're going to have the distortions in that goes back to the restructuring of how you do it. Who has the real estate? What do you do? So it requires the art of doing a proper restructurings of the ownership of that, so that entity becomes economic. Of course, price declines. The key is not to let the public, let certain parts of the economy suffer terribly for that, particularly the public. So just as we around the world don't allow bank failures to cause the individuals who have their money in the bank to lose money, but you allow the bank to fail, it's that kind of process that China will have to go through and is going through.
Okay. And I remember off the top of my head, a bit of an alarming statistic. I think there's something like 20 million units in China, housing units, which have been paid for already, but which still haven't been delivered. Anyway, look, guys, we're out of time, bumping up against the next session.
There's been an initiative to complete those, a government initiative to complete those and move those through. Now what happens to them, how people use them, and that's a different question.
Indeed. All right, we're out of time. Please thank Ray Dalio for the last hour of our time.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹、干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，护肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。